Chinese Surprise and Iron Despise. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 15th, 2021. And on this date in history, in always, it's tax day, the day you have to pay your taxes. So make sure you get them in, or you'll never see your refund alive again. I know this is probably a down, dark way of looking at things, but you know, let's keep those things alive. Europe is really going to do a lot to try and recover after World War II, and one of the things here that they're going to do is try and take down things like nationalization, or not nationalization, but nationalism, and move more towards a united Europe. And so the Bretton Woods system, this starts an international military fund, the IMF, and the idea is to try and stabilize the economy first of Europe and back it with gold. Okay, so this would be something that would be in great competition with the United States and several of the other world powers because they were working together. One of the major problems that they have is they never get Great Britain to fully become a member of the monetary fund, the International Monetary Fund. Britain's never a part, and so whenever you have the Brexit a few years ago, it's going to cause some major problems. The World Bank, or the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, this gave loans to modernize infrastructure, dams, roads, sewers, cut down on disease in Europe, and do things to clean up the country. It was a very ambitious project, but some countries really took advantage of this, and as a result of this, Germany would become one of the greenest countries on earth with the emissions from their factories, to the way that they produce things, the fact that most of their country is powered by solar and by wind. But I digress. Okay, West Germany. So, in 1948, after 2.5 years of rebuilding, Great Britain, France, and the U.S. merged their zones together in Germany and Berlin, and they created a nation in West Germany, and they combined all their parts together in West Berlin to form a city as well. They let them have their own government, and they were recovered from the devastation of World War II. The Soviets were not done with Germany, however, and they formed a communist government in the Soviet zone. Now, if you're looking at the map on the top left-hand side, you're going to see that Berlin is well over 100 miles into the Soviet zone, and that was a zone that was split between the U.S., Britain, and France. And so the Soviets decided to challenge to see what we were and what we were made of. In many ways, this is very similar to what Hitler does both in the Munich conference and in the 6 months that follows it, whenever he invades and takes over all of Czechoslovakia. So Truman's been put in an awkward position. There were 2.5 million people living in West Berlin. They were allies to the United States at this point, and we had to protect our allies and our friends. So Truman has a couple of options. One, he can invade. Two, he can give up the property. He comes up with an ingenious third option, which was the Berlin airlift, where he flew in supplies. And this would include things like medicine, food, and coal. It would get very cold in Berlin in the winter, and without coal they wouldn't have survived. And also, most of the city was powered by coal at that time as well. So They started flying in. At some points, they had planes touching down every 30 seconds. And by the end of 11 months, they had more goods going in by plane than they did by train before that. And it ended the first battle of the Cold War without ever having to fire a shot. Now, because you have this major Cold War going on between two great powers, uh, despite the problems with this in the past, they decided to form an organization against each other. Now, you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, and this is a defensive alliance against communism, and it is created following the the Berlin airlift. You also have a organization called CENTO, and this fights communism in the Middle East. And then you have CETO, which is a Southeastern Asian organization that is there to also fight against communism as well. Now, the Warsaw Pact, on the other hand, this is a military alliance of communist nations in Eastern Europe, and it's formed by Soviet leaders and other communist leaders, and this is in direct opposition to NATO. Now, for anyone who has questions how what it was like to grow up during this time, and you may or may not have this, uh, you were indoctrinated at a young age to hate the Soviets. And it never really makes sense why you hate the Soviets, but you know you're supposed to. And on this slide, there's a little bit of propaganda that helps support that. And you may not be thinking about this much while we're talking about this now, but if you look at the difference in verbiage between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, you have a defensive alliance and you have a military alliance. They both do exactly the same thing, but these words were chosen very carefully because, uh, well, NATO is defense, which means it's to protect. So you have a little bit of a positive feeling just by hearing those terms. And Warsaw Pact, this is a military alliance which is aggressive. And so just by terming things this way, you plant small little seeds that you can grow into something much more volatile. Okay, so we now have a secret war. Let's see what we can do to try and end it. So one of our diplomats, a guy by the name of George Kennan, the guy on the left with the never-ending forehead, uh, he gets together with a Russian ambassador, and he puts together what's called the Long Telegram. Now they call it the Long Telegram because it's pretty long. In fact, I want to say that your OV is over the Long Telegram. And they talk about Russian insecurity and fear of the West, and that it is impossible for there to be peace between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And as a result, the United States decides to treat it like a virus or disease. The containment policy. Keep communism in its present borders. Now I know what you're thinking. I have no idea what this means. You're going to force someone to be in one area and away from other people and think that something's not going to spread. I know it sounds unrealistic and you couldn't possibly understand that. By the way, I hope none of you forgot what sarcasm is or ironic speaking because guess what? I just snuck some of that in when you weren't looking. Okay. By the way, the on the right hand side you see the political cartoon. You see Uncle Sam at the top, and he's trying to push everything towards the Soviet Union and the tiny little bear there. On the other side, on the picture at the bottom, you see the bear. The bear does represent the Soviet Union or Russia, and it's pushing into these other territories as well. And the United States is going to try and stop them. Now, there's really no actual fighting between the Soviets and the United States. Most of it is wars that's fought using other people, so it's no direct conflict between the two countries. Now, The National Security Act. This is going to create the Joint Chief of Staff, basically the person that is in charge of the president's cabinet, the the main advisor to the president. Okay, this puts the Department of Defense over the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Department of Defense will actually replace the Department of War because again, remember we want to be seen as the good guys, so no longer do we have a Department of War. Now we have the Department of Defense, so we are nice, good people. Okay, so make sure that you get that separation there. It's the fact that the United States is the good guys. Okay, so this creates the National Security Council. I'm sure you've heard of the NSA before. They've made our lives so much easier in no way whatsoever, and they have the right to spy on us all the time. In addition to the NSA, it creates the CIA, okay, the Central Intelligence Agency, and this is basically our whole spy group. They work around the world to either prevent revolutions or cause revolutions. We're trying to hurt communist nations any way we can or prevent them from developing. We use secret or covert operations. Okay, and this does work in Turkey, Iran, and Greece. Now, we talked about Turkey and Greece earlier, where we sent them $400 million. Well, we also had the CIA there working to try and destabilize the communist movements in those countries. So all of this is an attempt of us trying to take over and rule the world. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So the Soviet Union does what American scientists don't think possible, and that's develop the atomic bomb in 1949. Oh, I'm sorry, in 1947. They developed the atomic bomb, and people were awestruck and terrified over here. So, as a result of this, we create two scapegoats in the Rosenbergs and have them executed for giving away atomic secrets, believing that the Soviets would never be able to engineer such a thing. Okay? Well, they went on 2 years later, and in 1949, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union developed the hydrogen bomb, which was thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, at this point, the US and Soviets began to mass produce these weapons. And this helps create what's called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And basically, either side making any type of offensive with nuclear weapons would lead the other side to launch all of their nuclear weapons. And what this would ultimately do would it would end all life on Earth. So the great dangers in having mutually assured destruction or having atomic weapons by two major superpowers is the fact that they could wipe out everyone on Earth if there was a fight. Because not only would they attack each other, but they would attack all the members of the Warsaw Pact and NATO and CETO and CENTO. So basically, every part of the world would be bombarded with atomic weapons. Cloud cover from the atomic bomb would cover the entire Earth, and from there all the vegetation would die, and so would everyone else. So not really a happy ending. Now, here's where everything goes wrong, and this will be something that we will reference here probably until the middle of April. Okay, so China, in October 1949, Mao Zedong, that's him on the left-hand side, and the communists set up the People's Republic of China. They kick out Chiang Kai-shek. Now, Mao Zedong, if you remember, I said was the largest mass murderer in history. He was responsible for about 100 to 150 million Chinese deaths under his regime. Now, Chiang Kai-shek ends up moving to Taiwan, and in a very childish manner, for about the next 30 years, the United States recognizes Taiwan as China, and their government as the legitimate government of China. Meanwhile, uh, Mao Zedong is in charge of actual China. So, in a short period of time, we went to 0 nations that were communist to 1917, where you have the largest landed empire on the world, the Soviet Union, communist, and now in 1949, 32 years later, over a quarter of the world's population is now communist. Truman and the Democrats are blamed for the loss of China, and therefore, every time the communists do something while a Democrat is in charge of the government, they have to respond with force. The Republicans don't because they're not blamed for losing China. But since the Democrats were in charge when China was lost, it's all their fault. And trust me, the Republicans will not let them forget that. Collectivization. So, in China's attempts, well, in China's efforts to turn China into a true communist nation, they had to force everyone into certain positions. And so China's going to, in 1955, nationalize all private farmland, industry, and commerce so that everything's controlled by China. Okay? In the Great Leap Forward, they tried to increase food production by creating the People's Communes, speed up economic growth, create a classless society, and basically they learned nothing from the way that the Soviets tried to institute the same programs, because when the Soviets do this, it causes mass famines throughout the Soviet Union. People die by the millions, and it's even worse in China. It's estimated that between 100 and 150 million people died during Mao Zedong's reign, that died as a direct result of his squads that would kill people, to problems with starvation, both intentional and unintentionally, throughout China. But it does work to control the population. If you just kill everyone, then you're in charge. So don't get any ideas, anybody. So the Korean War. After World War II, the U.S. rebuilt South Korea into a democracy. 3 days after we dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and 6 days after we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and started moving its troops into different places in Eastern Asia. And one of the places they went was North Korea, where they made it a communist government. The government was separated at the 38th parallel. The U.S. troops controlled the south, and the north, again, was controlled by the Soviets. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded the south and almost pushed the forces completely out of South Korea. You'll see it a little bit better on the map on the next slide. As you can see on the map on the left, they push all the way down to the small pink area in the southern on the southern tip of South Korea. So at this point, it was not a U.S. action, but the United Nations decided that they were going to make a move, and so they called for an army from the United Nations to combat this invasion into the sovereign nation of South Korea. So the UN forces arrived. They're under General Douglas MacArthur, the man who commanded the Pacific during World War II. And he actually, instead of going in and attacking from the territory that we held in the south, he moves over to the western side of Korea, catches them completely off guard, and this is called this is Incheon. Okay, so the Battle of Incheon. And they push back the North Korean forces into China. Now, at this point, Douglas MacArthur wanted to fix the problem and the mistake made by Truman, or at least what everyone believed was a mistake by Truman, and that was letting China fall to communism. So MacArthur wanted to invade China with nuclear weapons, basically destroy everything of value until they can go in, remove Mao Zedong from the from leadership from the country, and replace it with a democracy. Truman said no, and then MacArthur leaked to the press that Truman said no, made him look like a communist sympathizer, and so he was fired by Truman. And while they were bickering, 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the border and overwhelmed the UN forces. Again, remember, this is not just a U.S. defense. This is actually a United Nations defense of South Korea. It's an important difference. So, by 1951, the UN forces had actually pushed the Chinese forces and North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. And there the war would stagnate over the next 2 years. And eventually, China and North Korea would sign an armistice because Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear weapons. And this is much more of a recurring thing with Eisenhower. As a man of war, he did not want to go to war with other countries because he knew the very cost of it. And, being one of two nations on Earth that had nuclear weapons, it was much more of a deterrent to do this. Eventually, the border will stay at the 38th parallel. There is no victory but containment. That's a key note right there. No victory but containment. So the Korean War was a turning point in the Cold War. Before this, we used political pressure, we used economic pressure, and we used different types of schemes like we did with the Berlin airlift to try and contain communism. But at this point, the U.S. began to use its military. It also expanded the Cold War beyond Europe and into Asia. And now, anytime that there is any type of communist attack, if a Democrat is in office, they are forced to go to war because Truman lost China to communism. So that's going to kind of be the theme for everything they do from this point forward. The Second Red Scare is a time period in the United States where things kind of go off the wall. Okay, it really begins when Joseph McCarthy says he has a list of 205 communist agents that had infiltrated the State Department. This is the department that's in charge of our diplomats and our relationships around the world, and the thought was if they were in there, they could be anywhere, and this could be the end of the United States. And whenever there's this kind of panic that something's wrong, people will believe anything. It doesn't matter if it's founded in any way, they'll follow it and they'll treat it like it's the gospel. And so, in addition to that, he also accuses Democratic Party leaders of corruption and said that they had lost China. And this will affect really all policy by Democrats for the next 40 years. So, what he would do is he would make the accusation that you were guilty. And he'd put you on the stand, televised trials. And so if you didn't say anything, if you were quiet, then he was like, wow, you seem too guilty to say anything. And if you panicked, you're like, whoa, we must have hit this one on the button. So no matter how you responded, he still had a way of getting to you. Okay? So he ruins reputations, and he also attacked several people in Hollywood. Some of them had made propaganda films for the U.S. About our relationship with the Soviet Union during the war, and then during this time period, it was almost impossible for them to find work. And things were going really well for him until he attacked George Marshall. And the minute that he attacks George Marshall, he loses all credibility, and well, that's whenever he fell from grace. Now, the U.S. economy was one of the strongest economies of the world during this time period. 80% of all world trade passed through U.S. hands, and 50% of world productive capacity was under the control of the United States. Now, they wanted to take some steps to try and prevent major world wars from happening in the future, and so they have a couple different organizations that they create to do that. The first one's called the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, and the thought was if they regulate trade and remove tariffs between all of the nations of the world, that you would have a much more stable economy and a much more stable environment that does not lead to war. This is replaced about 40 years later in 1997 by the World Trade Organization. Now, in moving into this direction with the World Trade Organization, they get attacked quite a bit for seemingly ignoring environmental and health concerns and only focused on profit. But this is a world we live in, so I doubt that there's any major shocks from that. It may have helped prevent some major wars, but it also created some very wealthy billionaires. Satellite nations. Now, in the same way that the United States had protectorates, where the United States controlled other nations, we advised them, and we sent our military to protect / intimidate them. The Soviet Union does the same thing in Eastern Europe with Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Albania. Anyway, so basically the Soviets control all of this. Okay. Now, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMCON. So the Soviets organized the Eastern Bloc to create specialization of production. So this could be something anywhere from agriculture, like they really forced onto the hands of the Ukraine, or industrialization, which they used East Germany for. Now, there was basically a separation, and on one side you have communist nations, on the other side you have Western democracies with the same type of economic system as the United States. And so Churchill calls this line that separates East and the West as the Iron Curtain. Now, in many of the areas of Western Germany and Austria, there is a radio station that broadcasts. It's called the Voice of America, and there's also Radio Free Europe. And this broadcast messages. Eventually, there will also be television stations that are broadcast through the same type of thing, and they go into the Iron Curtain, so people over there could, on their regular televisions, pick up broadcasts from the United States as a way of us kind of, shaking our fingers at them. Christian Democrats. This is a political party that was created in the 1950s in Europe. This is it's much more moderate political parties. And for those of you who aren't familiar with moderates, on the one side you have communist, on the other side you have fascist. And somewhere in the middle between splitting everything among everyone and people holding all the power and controlling your lives is moderates. And they're really pushing for democracy and economic reform. And this was active in several nations throughout Europe at the time. And it moved through Europe pretty easily as a result of the European Union that is slowly being created. But with the international Monetary Fund, the IMF, it makes moving ideas and everything a lot easier going from country to country. Now, mass marketing. TV commercials are going to sell the good life all around the world, and this includes the U.S. and the Iron Curtain. Uh, the Americans in general will use sexuality to sell products, and if you could make it into the Soviet Union with things like Coca-Cola products or jeans, it was said that you could buy a pair of jeans over here for about $8 and sell them for $100 in the Soviet Union. So you just go in with a full suitcase full of jeans, and you could sell them over and make yourself a pretty hefty profit. Due to all the success from the previous 50 to 100 years in U.S. production, Western countries in Europe and the United States stopped producing a lot of industrial products and started to become much more of a white-collar job place, where people were doing much more office work than they were doing actual manual labor of any type. Manual labor is referred to as blue-collar, and a lot of that has to do with it being easier to clean dirt and soot out of blue material or jean material than it is out of your suit and tie that you would wear to work in a white collar job. Now, the communists do have a lot of criticism for the way that things are done in the West. Okay, things like high levels of crime, which is a major problem in the United States and most of Europe. High suicide rates. Social dislocation confirmed by Marxist alienation caused by the excess of capitalism. Just this strong feeling of loneliness. That basically Marxism is a big push for struggle in life, and basically the lack of struggle is the lack of ability to adapt to difficult situations. So there are some people that have other types of opinions as well, like E.F. Schumacher. He is a Buddhist economist who develops this idea of small is beautiful, and wants to try and balance the needs of future generations with the health of the planet. Everything is not important for now. You do things in a way that's that you don't damage the planet and everything else for the future of humanity. So, well, we made it to the end of another day. Hope everyone's having a good day. We've been very successful here. So everyone be safe. Don't cocaine, don't AIDS. And I will see all of you soon. This is Mr. Dugdale, and I will see you on the other side. Don't cocaine, don't AIDS, and don't COVID. Don't COVID thy neighbor's wife.